Sox fans.
We're the blue-collar people here. We say back in the day when these kinds of things happen. So welcome again to Chicago, and we're thrilled to have you. God bless you. Thank you.
Well, as Father mentioned, that we have a schedule here. We're a little bit behind, but we're going to be sticking as closely as we can with our schedule, only because I don't believe in torturing people, only students. Since you're not my students, we're going to take a break after 1 hour. So we're going to try to give you an opportunity to take a break and get up and stretch and whatnot. So don't feel like you're confined there, because I know how it is sometimes when people go on and on and on, and you wonder, will this ever end? Why did I come to this? Hopefully not. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know their names, don't we? We see them in the church very often in the Royal Gate. I noticed it today upstairs. You have the evangelist there on the doors that close the Royal Gate. On the pendentives holding up the dome of many churches, we have the 4 evangelists. They are extremely important. And no less so is the evangelist Luke. And as Father mentioned, in the past you have had many people come and speak to you about Luke as a physician, as a healer, and even somebody who came and talked about him as an iconographer. But we're going to talk about him in his most important role, in my opinion, as an evangelist. The evangelist. And this is because we don't know enough about the Gospels. And of course, it is as an evangelist that Luke really has his lasting importance in the church and impact in the church. And the last of these talks will be tomorrow. And we're going to talk about his lasting impact in the church as an evangelist. So, the first talk today is about St. Luke as the investigative historian. And I wanted to talk to you about him first as a historian, because that's one of the words or titles we use for St. Luke in, believe it or not, in biblical studies. Luke the historian, that's his nickname for us. So, as you know, we have those 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, what about other Gospels? Were there other Gospels? That seem to have been some earlier Gospels, but not later ones. You see, when I was at Harvard, they were very interested in a book called the Gospel of Thomas. And they actually wrote books called the 5 Gospels. Well, there's a little problem with the Gospel of Thomas. It's heretical. Okay? Of course, that doesn't matter to anybody in Harvard. All right? They don't care that it's heretical. They were very fascinated by it, and they wanted to kind of raise its status. And I said, but it's heretical. Okay? And you know what one young lady said to me? And I was in class, of course I was a student. And who decided what would be in the Bible? Old white men. And I was like, whoa, where did that come from? Okay. In other words, we should decide what's in the Bible. But the fact is, there's a reason why the church chose these Gospels. Now, some of you might see a program advertised on the History Channel or something about the lost books of the Bible, the mysterious books, the hidden books, the secret books, those Da Vinci Code books. Okay, all of that is complete nonsense. They are false Gospels, and we call them Apocrypha. Now, they seem very ancient, right? Because, we have Proto-Evangelium of James and Gospel of Thomas, which may have been written about the same time, around the year 150, which is pretty late. I mean, going back in time, or we say very early. It sounds very old. They sound like maybe they should be in the New Testament, being that old. But they're not old enough. They're historically not reliable. And the reason why I'm making a case for this is because we have to be able to explain why the New Testament is reliable, why our Gospels are historical. This is very important. Now, what's the difference between those other Gospels that we reject, including the Proto-Evangelium of James, which was not written by James? Okay, and I know some people say, yeah, but it's in the church and it's okay for historical. No, it's not. This is what priests will say. Excuse me, fathers. We get our information about the Virgin Mary from it. I'm horrified when I hear this. We don't get information from false books. The church knew the life of the Virgin before that book was ever written. Somebody took what they knew and then they embellished it and they amplified it and created the book. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? The church knew all about the Theotokos and her parents and her life in the temple and all of these things. So it's very important that we understand why those books are not in the canon and why the books that we do have are. So what's the difference between the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and something like the Gospel of Thomas or the Proto-Evangelium, which may have been written, 100 years or 110, 120 years after the time of Christ? Well, let me ask you something. Who remembers 9/11 in this room? Okay, keep your hands up. Drop your hand when I come to something you don't remember. Who remembers Clinton's impeachment in 1998? Remember that? What about Nixon's resignation in 74? This is a lot of people here have lived a long time. What about the assassination of John F. Kennedy? That's more than 60 years ago. What about World War II? How many of you have a living memory of World War II? Some of you do. Roger does here. Roger, do you remember the Great Depression?
No.
No, okay. He remembers World War II. He remembers, how old were you when the war was going on?
I was about 3 or 4. I was born in 40. So.
Okay, so you don't have a real strong
No.
memory of it. Now, how many in here remember World War I or the Civil War? Nobody. Now, here's the difference. Those decades, the difference between anybody having a living memory, even anymore, of World War I, there are some people, but not too many. There might be some, but nobody has a living memory of World War I. There might be a World War II, I misspoke a moment ago. Nobody has a living memory of the Civil War, but the difference between remembering the assassination of JFK, which most of you in this room seem to have a recollection of, and remembering the Civil War is 100 years. That's the difference between the canonical Gospels and the Apocrypha. The canonical Gospels are based on real history and historical memory of the church. The Apocrypha were written by people who had never known the apostles, never knew Jesus Christ, etc. So this is a tremendous difference. And we rely on our Gospels as historically accurate. It's very important that we insist upon this because, unfortunately, a lot of Bible scholars don't believe them to be historically accurate. And what's really amazing is that other scholars in other disciplines like history, like Romanists, people who are experts in the Roman Empire, they consider our Gospels to be reliable sources of information. But a lot of Bible scholars don't. And this is so odd. But it's because of this Western mentality that many scholars have. They assume that in order to be a real scholar, you have to be a skeptic. You have to be able to prove everything by analysis, by science, by reason. So they analyze everything that happens, and then they say, well, Jesus never said this. Jesus couldn't have known that. Jesus didn't do this. Jesus didn't say that or go there or whatnot. So this is very important because we know as Orthodox Christians that the church preserved a memory of all of these things, that they are real events. Jesus was a historical person. And that's why we don't give any credence to the other books that are not historically based. It's very important. Because if we say, well, yeah, but those books, we like them and they have stories, some of those Apocrypha have stories about Jesus like cursing little children and they die, and then he brings them back to life and things like this. This is not the Lord. This is not the knowledge of the church. This is not the life of the church. This is not what the church has preserved. We have to protect our history and insist on its truthfulness. Because as soon as we start to go down the road and say, well, the Apocrypha are okay, You can go ahead and read them, because believe me, I'm not talking about Old Testament books, in case you're not sure. I'm not talking about Old Testament books that Protestants call Apocrypha. I'm talking about false apostolic books. None of the fathers ever say you should read those books. None of them. Because the church believes and knows that its history is important, because Jesus was a historical person. Why do we say in the Creed that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate? Why mention Pontius Pilate? Because it's the history. It grounds Jesus in history. And this is what St. Luke does better than any other evangelist. That's why we're talking about history. Now, why is it that some people recognize the reliability of the Gospels? These are historians. And what I'm telling you, it's fascinating to me to read people outside of our discipline, the discipline of biblical studies, talk about the Gospels as reliable sources of historical information, and the Bible scholars don't consider them so. It's so bizarre. Well, historians evaluate the trustworthiness of a historical source, and they don't automatically exclude it just because it's a religious text, or just because the writer had some bias. Okay, because every writer has a bias. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a perspective. So what historians do is they look at our Gospels and they analyze them according to certain factors, and they decide whether or not they are historically reliable. Now, that's different from saying that Jesus is the Son of God. This is not something that historically verifiable, but that he did certain things, that what he did and what he said, that these things really happened. This is what we're talking about. So one of the things that they do is they evaluate documents for what they call verisimilitude. And that is whether or not this seems true, and depending upon certain factors. For example, they look at the Gospels and they try to see whether or not they are accurately reflecting the culture, the times, the people, the places. So for example, if someone was to write a story set in China, if I was trying to write a story set in China, and I've never been to China, it would be full of all kinds of errors, cultural errors and geographical errors and things like this. We don't see that in the Gospels. There was a person called Pilate. There were Pharisees. They did behave in this manner. There is a place called the Sea of Galilee. So the Gospels are consistent and accurate in the verifiable details. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this is one thing that we look at. The next thing that historians look at is whether or not there are what they call whether or not the writings are first generation witnesses. That is, were they written during the lifetime of people who knew the subject, Jesus Christ? So they might have not have been written they weren't written during the lifetime of Jesus. I've got to tell you, people ask me all the time about The Chosen. Everybody's fascinated with The Chosen. What do you think about The Chosen? And I have a great difficulty watching it because it's full of all kinds of mistakes. Okay, so I have a lot of trouble enjoying that. And one of the things, but I try to watch it every once in a while because people ask me about it. So in one of the last ones I watched, I think they started up. So I watched this one, and Jesus is speaking, and he's talking about, I think he's himself as the Good Shepherd. And John, the Apostle John, is taking notes as Jesus speaks. And I'm like, that's crazy. John and Matthew are writing their Gospels as Jesus is preaching. That didn't happen. Okay? That did not happen. And I just thought it was so hysterical because he's sitting there taking notes on what? They didn't have ballpoint pens. You got my point? You had to have a quill and ink. You couldn't stand in a crowd like a reporter and take notes. Why is that so important to the Protestants who are producing this? Because they don't accept the authority of the church to say that these Gospels are true and accurate. Do you understand my point? This is why. So they try to show, there were eyewitnesses and they were taking this down. That's not what happened. Okay? So there were, however, many, many, many first-generation witnesses. People who are alive. Do you know why this is important? because it is later generations, when they write about a historical figure, that tend to exaggerate and sort of, embellish. That's why the Apocrypha are full of all kinds of embellished stories. They're over the top. They're kind of fanciful. They seem like fairy tales, and they are. They're not written within the lifetimes of people who actually knew those people. So, and that's why all the Apocrypha will tell you who wrote it. They're not anonymous. Okay? These are the secret sayings that Jesus said to Mary Magdalene. These are the secret sayings of Thomas. You understand what I'm saying? They're trying very hard to prove that they're really the author, and of course we know they weren't. Now, why is that important? Just think about this. We have no writings that have first generation attestation about Moses, about Abraham, about Alexander the Great. The writings about Alexander the Great that talk about his life and his exploits were written 200 years later. There was nobody alive at that time to verify whether or not that's true. But one of the things that our evangelist Luke does is he makes sure, and he told us at the very beginning, that he has verified everything in his gospel. So this is very important. We have multiple sources, four gospels, all written within the lifetimes of people who knew Christ. Now, this is important because here's one of the things it's amazing what Bible scholars will say. They'll say, oh, this never happened. The church just added this later. You know how many students I had who got very disturbed by this? It's so sad. Jesus never said this from the cross. This didn't happen. They just said that later to make it look like Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. This didn't happen, Jesus didn't say this, Jesus couldn't know that, all these sorts of things. Well, or even Luke, because there's a lot of controversy about the census. We're not going to get into that, but there's some controversy about the census. Now, when Luke is writing, or any other evangelist, did they know that people are going to be talking about their gospel 2,000 years later and microanalyzing it to see, was there really a census at this time and all that? Of course not. They were truthful, not just because they were followers of Jesus Christ, but because they knew there were people alive who could say whether or not that event actually happened. Would you write something that you know you would be completely discredited because you falsified many things? You would never do that. You would care about your reputation, wouldn't you? Well, so did the evangelists. So this assumption that they just made things up is ridiculous. None of us would do that. And they certainly didn't, because they had people who were alive. That's why those first generation witnesses, people who were alive, and by the way, the last person healed by Jesus Christ died during the reign of Hadrian. You know how late that is? That's like 117, 118. The last person healed by Jesus Christ died that late. So there were lots and lots of witnesses. This is the other thing I don't like about The Chosen. What I've seen of it so far is they're not very busy. I don't see Jesus doing a lot of stuff. People are hanging around a lot. Okay, have you noticed that? People are visiting, some of the apostles are falling in love with girls and they're sort of wooing them and they've got wives. They didn't do that. Jesus was working 7 days a week. And he said, I'm always working and I never stop working. My Father works and so do I, even on the Sabbath. He is healing people. He was active. They didn't have time to just kind of hang around, and they showed other things that just, what can I say? Don't take me there. The last one was about Hanukkah, and they were giving presents. Oh my goodness. That didn't happen. The Jews in America that started giving presents for Hanukkah. People are going to give presents for Hanukkah. Right. Okay? It's just so silly. And they were staying in an inn, and everybody was on a little bed. They all had their little twin beds in their rooms. Are you kidding me? They slept on the floor, on a pile of hay, in a cave. I mean, seriously. The way they're presenting, people love it because it makes the apostles seem real, but to me it's unreal. They were 100% devoted to Jesus Christ. They were with him day and night. They left their wives. That's what they say. We left everything and followed you.
Smart man.
That's what they did. Okay, no comments from the peanut gallery. Anyhow, is that we have 4 sources of information about Jesus Christ. This is a historian's dream. Rarely is there one biographical writing about a living person by a person who knew them in their time. Maybe 2. 4, this is amazing. And in addition to this, I mentioned, Jesus healed thousands of people. Thousands of people every day. He was mobbed by people. People heard he was in a village, and they came from all over. Thousands and thousands of people. So there are so many witnesses to his miracles. And that people could say today, well, this thing never happened. Jesus didn't do any miracles. Are you kidding me? Why did people come to him? Because he had nice hair? I mean, seriously, you have to think about these things. We have to be able to explain these things to people who say, oh, there's no proof that any of these things happened. Well, you know what? Pretty soon after the church began, the Jewish leaders tried to destroy it. The easiest thing that Jews could do, because the Jews and then later the Romans wanted to destroy the church, the easiest way to do it was to say that Jesus never did any miracles. Did they say that? Of course not. Because that was so well known that he was a wonder worker that nobody would ever think to say that never happened. Instead, they said what? He did these things with the power of the devil. That's what the Jews still say today. Nobody says he didn't do those things because it's so well attested. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of witnesses. Do you see my point? So you cannot say that these things never happened. It's only stupid people today who say these things never happened, or even that Jesus didn't exist. Are you kidding me? Okay, the easiest thing to do would be say the miracles never happened. Now, so those of you who think you're so smart, how many disciples did Jesus have? Don't say 12.
Right.
That's what we say in church when there aren't too many people. Well, Jesus just had 12 disciples. No. Jesus had thousands of disciples. Thousands of people believed in him. Why? If you have any skeptics in your family that don't believe in the Gospels, ask them why people came to hear and to see Jesus Christ. Because it's so obvious when we just look at it from that perspective. Why? Because these were Jews. There's no Romans involved, by the way. Somebody's saying, well, why didn't the Romans write about Jesus if he really was the Son? Because he didn't preach to Romans, you knucklehead. Okay? There's no Romans in the synagogues. There's no Romans at the temple. Come on. Oh, if Jesus really was doing all these things, the Romans would, they're going to go follow some rabbi because, come on, it's so silly the way people think about these things. So I'm just telling you, why did people believe in Jesus Christ? Because of one thing. They knew the prophecies about the Messiah. They had been hearing the prophecies their whole lives.
Right.
They knew the signs of the Messiah. And he's the only one who ever did those signs. That the blind would see, and the lame would walk, and the deaf would hear. Now, it's easy to say, I'm the Messiah, follow me. And after Jesus Christ, there was a guy named Bar Kokhba who said he was the Messiah. And some Jews actually followed him and started another revolt. But he never gave sight to any blind person. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? The Jews knew the signs, that he would judge in righteousness, that he would do these things. And you can't fake that. You could be like a modern sort of faith healer where you could get a couple of people to pretend to be healed. But you can't heal thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands by being a fake. Do you see my point? So these things happened. We have many thousands of witnesses that prove that what Jesus really did. Otherwise, they wouldn't be coming to see him. So these things really happened. And we have these historical sources, the Gospels, that tell us about these things. Now, so why do we have 4 Gospels? Do we need 4? Well, there was a time when there was a fellow, his name was Tatian, and he said, we don't really need 4 Gospels. We have 4 accounts of the crucifixion, 2 accounts of the birth of Jesus. Let's just blend them all together and make one giant gospel. He did this in the Syriac language. And it was called the Atasaron. Now, Tatian, this was very popular, by the way, But the church did not approve of it because the church said we have 4 independent accounts of Jesus Christ. And so the church decided to choose to keep the 4 Gospels separate. And there is a wonderful thing about that. We get 4 different perspectives on Christ. So if I was to say to you, I want you to write for me a brief book about your mother. You're going to write a book about your mother. But if I say to your sister or brother, you write a book about your mother. And I say to your mother's friend, you write a book about your mother. You're going to have certain things that are exactly the same and other things that are different because they each have a different relationship, right? They each know things. There might be certain stories that they know about. We find this later sometimes when somebody dies, somebody comes and tells us a story about our loved one. We never heard of it. We didn't know anything about this. So this is the value in having 4 evangelists. So why is St. Luke called the historian? Because, for a number of reasons. Number 1, he is the only one who wrote a sequel to his gospel. Okay? Would you love it if John wrote a sequel and Mark wrote a sequel? What happened next? He wrote this sequel, the rest of the story. And he tells us everything that happened after that. We call it the Acts of the Apostles. It's really the first history, and it's the only history of the primitive church that we have. How important is that in the life of the church? He tells us about Pentecost. He tells us about, of course, the ascension before that, how they replaced Judas, how St. Paul came to be a follower of Jesus Christ, how the church moved out of Judea and why, the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr. All these things we know about because of St. Luke. He's also a historian because he alone gives us certain important details about Jesus Christ that we would not know if it weren't for Luke's gospel. One of them is that Jesus and John the Forerunner were related. You know, we find out about Elizabeth and being a kinswoman of Mary. It doesn't say exactly the relationship, but the fact is, this is the only way we know. If it wasn't for that, we would have no idea. So we know that Jesus and John are related. We know that Jesus was born under Augustus Caesar, only because of Luke, because Matthew doesn't mention that. Matthew only mentions King Herod. So this helps us to date the birth of Christ. Luke explains why Jesus, this is so important, was born in Bethlehem. Most people were born and died in the village where they were their whole lives. And this is one of the things that people say about Jesus, why he can't be the Messiah, because they knew he was from Nazareth. Okay, so Luke tells us how it was because of the census that he came to be born in Bethlehem. Luke allows us to roughly date. We know what the year that Jesus was crucified because he gives us the date of the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. But he doesn't give it to us in the way that we would have today. Today we have years, fixed dates. For years, years have fixed dates. They didn't have that in antiquity. So Luke is a historian because he is educated. He's definitely the most educated of all of the evangelists, has the widest vocabulary, very precise vocabulary, and he writes in a classic Greek historical style. Now, I don't know if you recognize this. We're all familiar with in the days of the decree went out of Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. This was the first enrollment when Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's the birth of Jesus. But after Jesus is born, after Jesus is grown and John is grown, this is how Luke begins chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, Lysanias the tetrarch of Abilene, in the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. That's how a historian dated his subject, because they didn't have, 1994, 2024. They didn't have fixed dates. They said, so many years after the reign of this king, when this guy was also in power, that's Pontius Pilate, when this one was the high priest, when this guy was tetrarch in Galilee, etc. So with all of those dates, you know when the person was active. So this is classic. This is only Luke does this. Because of this, we can date approximately when Jesus had his ministry. We also know, because of St. Luke, how old Jesus was when he began his ministry. He's the one who says he was about 30 years old. Now, if it wasn't for that, we would know if Jesus was 15 or 20 or 50. But it's Luke that tells us he was about 30 when he began. Luke gives us the description of the ascension. He's the only one who describes the ascension at the end of his gospel and at the beginning of the book of Acts. And he, of course, also shows us his historical prowess and his education by the way he begins his gospel. He's the only one to address his gospel to a specific person. And the book of Acts is also addressed to a specific person. So we know who his audience was. And he gives us a classic introduction, which we see in a lot of patristic works and other works. So he's giving us his motivation. We're understanding why he wrote. And that's called the prologue of the Gospel of Luke. So he's writing to this person named Theophilus. Now, some people have said that Theophilus is a fictional character. He didn't really exist. And that's because his name means one who loves God or friend of God. But I think he really did exist. And of course, the tradition of the church is that he really did exist. Because he addresses him as an important person, Your Excellency, Theophilus. Here's the prologue of St. Luke's Gospel. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the elements in it, which are quite extraordinary. So he says this: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed." Now, we don't know who Theophilus was. Some people think maybe he was an important ruler. Some people think that he was a catechumen. And it's possible. I'll explain that in a moment. But one of the things Luke does is he says, as much as, even though many have already attempted or undertaken to compile a narrative, this word that he uses for attempted, epihideson, suggests that it's kind of a dangerous or risky proposition. That he realizes that he's going to do something which might not work out so well. Of course, works out beautifully. But he mentions that others have written. He says, many others. So there were probably certain compilations of the deeds and words of Christ. We call those proto-gospels. Those have not survived. But he's not talking about the gospels afterwards, the fake ones. He's talking about early possible compilations of the words of Christ. He says, it seemed good to me to compile an orderly narrative. Now, the language that he's using here in this prologue is rather technical language. He uses the word diegesis, and he's going to make a declaration. It's also used for a narrative. And he talks about the eyewitnesses, автоптока, which is also the term which is used for guardians of records. People, he's presenting this as a real academic effort to present something verifiable as a good historian. Just as these things have been handed down to us, and there's the word for tradition, paredosan, has been handed down, but it's not just the way we think of tradition, well, this is my mother's traditional stuffing recipe. We mean tradition as something that was handed down by people who were entrusted. Remember, this is a largely oral society where people preserve things. Think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, was passed along orally for hundreds of years before it was written down. These were people who were entrusted with preserving things very accurately as an oral tradition. Then he says, I have investigated everything very accurately. And the word he uses, parakolutheo. Now, Greek has a kind of precision that the English language lacks. So, akolutheo is to follow. And sometimes this is just translated as followed. But this is not akolutheo, it's para-akolutheo. This means that you really look into it very carefully. And he uses the word akrivos, accurately, exactly, carefully. And this is the term that was used in many diverse fields, mathematics, philosophy, and history. So he's really telling you, I did the legwork. I verified everything that's in this book, and you can count on it. So he constructs this orderly account for Theophilus. Now, and why does he do this? That you might know the asphalia. And it's translated as truth, but it's really not the word truth. It's the word certainty. It's a modern Greek word for insurance, asphalia. So you can be assured, so you can have confidence that everything you were taught is true. And the word is katechesis. You were catechized. That's why some people think that Theophilus might have been a catechumen. It is the word for teaching, okay? But it's the same word that we use for catechism. So it's possible. So let's talk a little bit more about St. Luke's gospel, some of the basics of the gospel before we get to part 2. Who is his audience? Because we have 4 evangelists because they each had a different audience, a different purpose for writing. What was the audience? Of course, it's Theophilus, but beyond that, it's Gentiles. Now, how do we know that? Because the evangelists don't say, I am writing this gospel, especially for Gentiles. They don't say that. We have to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of analysis. Well, it is definitely Mark and Luke who wrote for a Gentile audience, non-Greek, non-Jews, Greeks. We should say really Greeks. That's what the church would have called them, Greeks. How do we know? Because they explain Jewish customs. So, for example, Mark explains how the Pharisees had this custom of washing the inside and the outside of the plates and the bowls. He goes on about this. St. Luke talks about how Jesus was circumcised on the 8th day according to the custom. If he's writing for Jews, they wouldn't have to explain this. How he was taken to this temple when he was 40 days old, that this was the custom of the Jews. So because of this, we see that he is writing for a Gentile audience. Now, where did he write his gospel? Some people say Rome because he was known to be a companion of St. Paul, and St. Paul ended his life there. But maybe also Greece. And my professor, I studied the Gospel of Luke at Harvard with possibly the greatest Lucan professor, Lucan expert of the 20th century. His name was Francois Bovon. He wrote 3 thick volumes on the Gospel of Luke. This was his life's work. And he was convinced that Luke wrote in Greece. And it's very interesting how he came to this conclusion. And it's a little change in the gospel that we see that we gave him this idea. Now, I come from California. So in California, it's very similar to Israel. You have the ocean on the west. You have the ocean, you have ocean breezes, you have a sort of a slow, low hill country, and then you have desert on the other side of mountains. We get heat waves when the wind comes from the east. Okay, it comes from the deserts, from Arizona, Nevada. When those are Santa Ana winds, that's when we get heat waves. Because most of the time the wind is coming from the ocean and it's nice and temperate. So, in Matthew and Mark, Jesus talks about being able to discern the signs of the times. And he says, when the wind blows from the east, you know it will be hot. Okay, the same thing in California. When the wind blows from the east, it's hot. But in Luke's gospel, it doesn't say that. He says when the wind blows from the south, you know it will be hot. That comes from the Sahara Desert. And I'm thinking, I wonder if Luke was in Cyprus. Because I don't think Bovon thought about, he said Greece. And I'm not sure about the climate in Greece, whether or not they have heat waves when the wind comes from, but I know Cyprus does. It gets very hot. Wind comes off of the desert. When the wind blows from the south, it's very hot. So he was probably writing from Greece or maybe Cyprus. This is what I'm thinking. We don't really know for sure. Now, why did he write? Besides investigating everything and proving that it's historically verifiable, why did St. Luke write? Because all of the evangelists had a purpose for writing their gospel. There was something they wanted to convey. Well, he is the one who emphasized, better than anyone, that Christ is the universal Savior of the entire world, especially the people that nobody seemed to care about. The women, the poor, the outcasts, the sinners, the tax collectors. Now, you might say, well, Jesus is like that in all of the Gospels, and that's true. So this evening and afternoon, we're going to be talking about St. Luke and some of the differences between his Gospels and the others. But we're not talking about major differences. It's not like one Gospel says Jesus is the Messiah and Son of God, and another one doesn't. They all believe that Jesus was the Savior of the world. They all believe that Jesus was the Messiah and Son of God. But it was a matter of emphasis. This is what we see and do in biblical studies. We look at what each evangelist emphasizes because that's his purpose. And we're going to see in our next segment about the specific interest that St. Luke has in his areas of emphasis. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I'm going to take any questions or comments. But before I see some of you got this, I brought this little card for you if you want it. It has the location of all of my lessons, my podcast, orthodoxbiblestudy.info. It also has my website if you are interested in contacting me. Yes?
In the Acts, the 19th book, that's like one of my favorite pages in the Bible.
You like Acts chapter 19?
Yeah.
Why do you like it?
Well, he does show that he is in Ephesus.
Mm-hmm.
So he was definitely in the Greek world. I mean, as we know, that was a lot of the native part of the land was in Asia Minor. You know,
So
before the Turks took over thousands of years later.
Yes.
1,000 years later.
We have in the book of Acts what Bible scholars call the we narratives, because it switches to a first person plural account, and then we went here, and then we went there, and then we set sail, etc.
Yeah.
So that's the part of Acts that she likes, the we narratives. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
Where is the comment about the wind in the gospel?
I don't know. I'm going to have to look it up for you at the break. I don't know it offhand. I didn't think about having that for you. But it's somewhere in the middle. It's not at the beginning when he's a baby, and it's not at the end when he's being crucified. I'm sorry. It's in one of it has so many places where he's disputing with the Pharisees. I should have had that, but I'm just giving you what came off the top of my head. Yes?
So the parts that Luke probably wouldn't have himself been an eyewitness to,
Mm-hmm.
do we have any idea who he might have gotten that information from?
Well, again, that's sort of a matter of conjecture, but we can say, obviously, since only he and Matthew have the birth narratives, right? The account of the birth of Christ, and he's the one who has all the information about the Theotokos. There's a long history in the church, a tradition of him knowing her, of her painting her portrait, etc. So I would assume that this comes from her. But also remember that the reason why I'm saying we don't need the Proto-Evangelium of James to know about the life of the Virgin Mary, that she was stepmother to Joseph's children. When they got married, he was a widower, he already had children, that's the ancient tradition of the church. They lived with her, and they knew her story. It's kind of silly to imagine that they didn't know her family, that she would have come from the same village. They would have known her story. And that same family, the family of Joseph, is very important in the history of the primitive church in Jerusalem. It's not just James. James is the first person. But after him, it's his brothers and cousins who are the bishops of Jerusalem. There's a consistent tradition of the family of Jesus being involved in the early church. And they knew all of these traditions about her. But other than that, we just have to guess. But even, as I said, throughout the first century, there would have been many people who were eyewitnesses to what Christ did. And, one of the things that we find kind of difficult to imagine about this is because we know that the average lifespan was not very old in those days. So I'm saying if Jesus, his ministry was, let's say, from the year 30 to the year 33, something like that, and then you're talking to somebody in the year 50 or 60 or 70 or 80, that seems like a long time, right? 50 years later. But remember that even though the lifespan, the average lifespan was 40, people didn't just drop dead when they turned 40. Okay, that's what my college students would say. The average lifespan was 40. Yeah, you didn't drop dead. A lot of children died in infancy or childhood. Women died in childbirth a lot. But if you got past those dangers, there were many people who lived to 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond that. We have martyrs who are old men. Polycarp dies as a martyr at the age of 86. We don't know, could have reached the age of over 90. So there were still, even later, toward the end of the first century, had to be lots of people who knew Jesus Christ and were people that he could verify this information with. Yes.
Luke 12:55 is the wind is mentioned.
12:55, thank you, Roger. There you have it, Luke 12:55. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
How about our fellow on the road to Emmaus? As our tradition says, that is Luke as well. Do you believe that? Does the church, can we verify that? I teach it that way,
Yeah, I would teach
but what do
it
you
that
say
way.
on that?
The reason why he's saying this, the story of the road to Emmaus is such a beautiful story, one of my favorites. It describes how on the day after Passover, two men are leaving Jerusalem, and they're talking about what happened to Jesus, and they're on the way to Emmaus. And they're described as this, Cleopas and another disciple. Now, the reason why we say that that's Luke is because it's standard that when an author is referring to himself, he uses that. He never says, Cleopas and I were walking. He just says, another disciple. We see that in the Gospel of John. We even see that in Paul when he talks about his own mystical experiences. He says, I know a man in Christ. Who? And that's kind of the tradition of the church, to sort of hide your identity out of humility. So that is the reason why the church has, and that's the long-standing tradition of
So
the
I
church.
can compare it to Paul in the third heaven, when
Yeah.
he's describing his very...
He doesn't say, I was taken
he does
up.
not say I.
Yeah, I know a man in Christ who. And of course, John as the disciple, the beloved disciple, or sometimes John describes himself as the other disciple. And so that's just kind of standard. So this is the reason that we have that tradition. So I don't see any reason to doubt that, because there's a reason. We see that pattern. It's not by itself. It's not isolated. Yes?
From choral study in Acts, I just recently learned that when we're talking about Gentiles versus Christian Jews now, I heard that the term Christian wasn't used until Antioch.
Right. It is, as she says about the term Christians and Jews, the term Christian came to be used in Antioch. So the followers of Jesus, they didn't see themselves as starting a new religion. They were Jews. They had a religion. They didn't wake up and say, we're not Jewish anymore. We believe in Jesus. Oh, we must be starting a new religion, right? Instead, they called their movement the Way. It was a way of life. It was a way of believing. It was a sect within Judaism. The term Christian comes in Antioch because people were referring to the Messiah, and the Greek word for Messiah is Christ, Christos. So they started talking about them as Christiani. The people kept talking about the Christ. The Christ. Oh, those Christ people. Christiani. So this is how they got that name. That is correct. In biblical studies in early church, sometimes we refer to them as Christians or Jewish Christians to distinguish them from Gentile Christians or Jews who were not believers. So we're in a sort of, unless we're going to say the first believers or followers of the way or something, we have to give them some name, so we'll use the term even though it's not exactly right. because they weren't called Christians in Jerusalem initially. It was only later because of the Greek language.
I was curious when we look at Messianic Jews.
Yes, when we look at Messianic Jews, Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
But don't continue on with the Christians?
Well, who are the Messianic Jews?
Yeah.
Are you asking that? Okay, Messianic Jews are Jews who believe in Jesus, who come to faith in Jesus Christ, but they are very Protestantized. And most of them, they have formed congregations, and they've been usually brought into the faith by Protestants. And they have a very Protestant style of worship. And then they try to incorporate some of their Jewish traditions, but they're not a direct connection to the early church. It's too bad they haven't found Orthodoxy. It will really be something if they do, because they will find that Orthodoxy is much closer. But they're very Protestant, and that partly because there's been a real outreach among Protestants to Jews, including in Israel, to teach them about the Messiah, and all good for them. One more. Go ahead, Father, and then we'll take a little break.
Okay, so we know that with the Gospel of St. Luke, we have these 2 chapters at the beginning that not only speak of Christ's birth, but also preceding that, the birth of St. John the Baptist. And this includes a beautiful story about what's happening in the temple with Zechariah. Do you think that Luke had a very good sense, and not only that, but an experience, I would hope, of what was happening in Second Temple Judaism, which is kind of all the rage today?
Would he know what was going on in
Yes,
Second
exactly.
Temple Judaism?
Yeah.
Yeah, because he was involved in it. Look, it depends. There are people who would say that Luke was not Jewish at all, okay? And there is a tradition that he, of course, was from Syria, some people would say that he was converted by St. Paul. But the tradition of the church is that he was one of the 70, and that's why yesterday, when they had the gospel reading for his feast is the sending out of the 70. That's the tradition of the church. So how familiar he was with the temple is if he was a Jewish Christian in the 1st century, he would have a familiarity with the temple. Not to the extent that someone might who was actually a priest, like John. We have the tradition of John. Was known to the high priest, and we think that John, the evangelist, was actually a priest. But he would know. He would be involved in it, at least until the destruction. So he would have to know. But it's difficult. When it comes to the traditions about Luke, they're kind of varied. So we do have some traditions that he was a Gentile, but others that he was Jewish and he was a member of the 70. I think that's a stronger tradition of the church by virtue of the gospel reading. Yeah. Anybody else? One last one, real quick, Father.
Something I wonder, I know everything is inspired by the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament, New Testament. When it comes to the genealogy of Christ,
Yes.
and he's very accurate, Luke, why he give a chance or opportunity to other religions or something?
Yes.
See the difference between, there is no consistency between Matthew and Luke. And we have to defend it. I wish it could have been easier if you just
Yes.
say the same thing rather than until now, Muslim particularly.
Muslims in particular
They
attack
go at that,
the
like
genealogy of Christ.
as if he gave them a chance.
Yeah, I think, I don't know why, his genealogy differs from Matthew in certain respects, and also, especially in terms of the grandfather, that's the most glaring difference. First of all, Luke traces the genealogy back to Adam, and that's a different purpose than what Matthew has, who begins with Abraham and traces the messianic heritage of Christ. Luke has a different purpose in that. But the Christians were being attacked for that a long time ago. And the person who answered it was Julius Africanus in the 3rd century. And he said that Matthew was giving the legal genealogy. In other words, he thinks that Joseph was adopted There was a physical genealogy, and then there was a legal genealogy. But, you know, Muslims can say what they want, no matter what we say, even if that didn't exist, they would still find something, right? But the best thing to ask them is how a person can be born of a virgin and not be the son of God. That's a stronger argument, I think, for the Christian faith than what they would say. But I don't think Luke had access to Matthew's genealogy. That would be one possible reason why. He didn't know it. He didn't have access to it. So there's a bit of a difference, but mostly he's trying to go back to Adam because he's showing Jesus as really human, as being descended from Adam, and then he's going to be baptized right after that, and he's the Son of God, right? He's not just Son of Man, but Son of God. Let's take a little break for a few minutes, and when we return, we'll do part 2, and we'll talk about some of the characteristics of Luke's gospel.
So 15 minutes and we'll reconvene at 3:45.
Okay.
Thank you very
That
much.
makes 10 minutes.
Yeah, correct. 3:45.
I know you were talking about the gospel, but I just was reading Oh, okay, yeah.
That I watch very closely.